26, I would have a very deep knowledge of especially child exploitation on the internet, but the internet itself generally, and therefore from a law enforcement point of view, and therefore my point of view will be law enforcement point of view, and it's not necessarily everybody else's point of view. And the internet is nothing if it isn't a complex sociological issue, and I would argue that child exploitation and the effect the internet has on that crime that has been with us since Adam was a boy, there's no doubt about that. And the effect of the internet is a societal issue that has to be addressed. And it has to be addressed along the line. My argument would always be to steal the 3 E's from road safety, which has been very successful, but the 3 E's of education, of enforcement, and of engineering have to be brought to bear on the internet and its effects and how we deal with it. So, I mean, you can talk about education. I mean, education of children, fine. Education of digital immigrants, like most of us in this room are. You know, this argument about those born before 96 are digital immigrants and those born after 96 are digital citizens. And, you know, how are we best served where the control of society is in the hands of the immigrants? You know, how best do we serve the citizens? And this is an argument and a breakdown. So the education of both the immigrants and the citizens. Education also of offenders or potential offenders is important to us. You know, do you realise that this material that you are masturbating to is actually produced only through the abuse of children? That this isn't a child in some far-off eastern country or in Eastern Europe, you know, that it's easy to kind of box off. These, you know, the vast majority of child sexual abuse takes place within the home, and therefore, because that connection is made between the child abuse material and the child pornography that's out there on the internet, that connection is there. Therefore, the vast majority of material that we're looking at and that we're seizing in searches and that's coming into our international database are actually white, middle-class children, aging in range from, we like to think that, we always think in terms of the child is anyone under 18. Again, the vast majority of material that we're dealing with is under 10. Everything from 18-month-old pre-speech children to pre-teen, and of course there is a lot of material then post-teen, post-puberty, right up to 18, but we tend not to concentrate on it because we've so much to do under 10, and that's the reality of our work. So educating people like yourselves, people, the deep thinkers, the people who are in a position to change policy, who are in a position to advise the change of policy, it's always a pleasure to talk to you because I'm using one of the E's. The second E, of course, is enforcement, and as a police officer, I believe in nothing more than robust, or nothing less than robust enforcement, where robust enforcement is required. But enforcement can also be prevention, and it's a point I'll make later on. Prevention is the cheapest form of policing, and you know, this whole idea, I often tie it in with road traffic offending again. You can tie it in with that, with drug offending. You know, back in the 70s, when drugs were just beginning to make their mark on Irish society, there was this belief system that if we can't see it, it doesn't exist, you know. And I remember talking to an officer who was a member of what were known as the Mockies at the time. They were young individual guards who went out on their own time doing drugs jobs in the end of the 60s, early 70s. And he said to me, he said, the worst thing we could ever have done, he said, because our skippers, our sergeants hated us, our inspectors hated us, our superintendents hated us, because every time we lifted a rock, there was another 100 people running out from under it. And I've already spoken here today about the volume, and that's the reality of it. The volume's monstrous. And every time you lift a rock, another 100 people run out from under it. And the resources aren't there. The resources, financial resources, the training, it's all just not there. We're still not coming to grips with it. It's all firefighting. It's a question of another big international job comes into a country, bring in 10 men to go and do this job, and bring in then 10 men, and they're gone for a year. And that's the reality. And it's just not possible to deal with all this. But yet, we would argue, and you'd have to argue from our logical point of view, standpoint, that every person who downloads and uses, for whatever reason, the vast majority of it, and I've already said masturbation, and I often get slagged about how many times I'll say masturbation in a presentation. But the vast majority of people who download material from the internet, who download this, you would have to say they are a danger to children. because this is what they're getting their kicks out of. And how much there's no empirical proof as to how much the internet has affected this old crime, because child abuse material has been out there since cameras were invented. So there's no doubt about that. And so how much has the internet affected it? And my argument might be different from other people's, and of course I can't make any firm statements except things like in 1998 here in Ireland was the first time we ever addressed the issue with law. Prior to that, it obviously didn't exist. And isn't it coincidental that that also came around the same time as the hit of the internet? And that's the whole area of enforcement. And then engineering. It's always very controversial when you make statements like, we need to change how the internet works. The internet was a network of networks designed by the military, passed over to academia. Academia never imagined for a split second that it would take off like it did. A few visionaries may have seen it for what it was at the time, but the reality is it's built on a trust model. You allow other people to connect to your computer because you trust them. And that obviously isn't going to work anymore, and there's all sorts of authentication and everything else required when you're allowing other people to connect to your computer, be it a web server, an email server, whatever it is. And this interconnectability is built on trust, or originally was designed to be built on trust. One academic lets another academic into his computer to view files. Tim Berners-Lee, who invented HTML, which allows our web to work, he designed it not with Facebook in mind. He designed it to allow other academics to read his paper, and during reading the paper there would be a hyperlink that would link to the paper that he was quoting from, or the paper that he was paraphrasing, or whatever it was. I mean, anyone who has dealt with academic papers knows about the whole bibliography and that at the end of it. So by stealing the 3 E's from the road safety campaign, I hope I've given you a little bit of my thinking on it in that sense. One of the reasons I've been invited here is because I work in Interpol, and so I'm going to talk about Interpol now more than, until for another 10 minutes or so anyway, just to give you a briefing as to what Interpol is and how it works, as distinct from what Hollywood would have you believe, which is of course that I spend my time abseiling out of helicopters, and, shooting bad guys, and flicking up the button on the gear lever to fire some rockets. The last time I abseiled out of a helicopter, I woke up on the floor holding my pillow. So connecting police and securing the world. An ambitious plan, no doubt. And I suppose that is what Interpol is all about. If you look here, the actual name of Interpol is actually the International Criminal Police Organization. ICPO is the actual name. Interpol was their telegram address in Paris originally, where they were set up in Saint-Cloud in Paris. And it later became their telex address. And of course it just became known as Interpol then because of that. And I think a couple of years ago they got an awful fright when they realised that there was a band from New York called Interpol, quite a good band too actually, but when they went to enforce the ownership of the name Interpol, they realised that it had never been registered, that it was an open name, just because it became known as Interpol, as distinct from being called Interpol from the very start. So the Organisation Internationale de Police Criminelle, the International Criminal Police Organisation is the name of it. And where I work is called IPSG, or Interpol General Secretariat, it's IPSG, and that's based in Lyon in France. As you can see from here, I'm not going to talk you through these slides in that sense, but you can see that it was set up in 1923, a time when just after Europe was recovering. It was set up after a meeting in Austria, and 1923 we were 5 years after the end of the Great War, the war to end all wars, and criminality. World War I was a huge eye-opener for Europe, in the sense that it opened Europe to travel. You had all the train systems and everything else that were being rebuilt after the war. There was a general need, especially in the kind of heartland of Europe, the Austria, the Germany, Italy, Spain, France, the heartland of Europe. There was a need for police to start communicating, and it was set up in Austria in 1923 and eventually moved to eventually moved to Paris, Saint-Cloud in Paris. There's 4 official languages, and it remains the same. So you have English, Spanish, Arabic, and French. German was an official language up until the end, till 1945. It basically, this building here is where I hang out, and you know, for my colleagues here, the Garda headquarters, I just want to tell you it's a really terrible place, and it's freezing there all the time, and you know, my children are starving, and it's a really terrible station, you know. Yeah, please, yeah. Fabulous building in a fabulous city, really. Lyon, at the crossroads of Europe, 100 kilometres from 150 kilometres from Geneva. It's only across the border from Italy, near the south, about 300 kilometres from Marseille. And that building houses only 120 police officers. The rest of the 550 staff are administration, accounts, personnel, printing section, IT, all those type of businesses. Where Interpol's strength is, it lies here. It's called the NCB, the National Central Bureau. And we have 188 member countries, and each of those 188 member countries has an NCB. And that NCB is housed generally in police headquarters, generally as a adjoint to the intelligence section of the police force in question. Generally speaking, the 188 member countries are our strongest point in Interpol, but they can also be our weakest point at times, because they end up filtering what goes in and out of the country to a certain extent. So it depends on the country, it depends on how active they are, how much they care about international affairs, how much they care about problems coming from outside their own countries. It's an international organisation. The General Assembly and the Executive Committee, which is made up of senior police officers from the different regions of the world. It's a 12-man executive committee. They advise the Secretary General, who's currently an American officer, or an American lawyer, actually, so there's hope for you yet. Ron K. Noble, and the President of the Executive Committee, who is the head of the Singaporean police. And so with advisors, and there are various different commissions then for control of files, for data protection, for all advising on finance, advising on needs, etc., etc. And then the General Secretariat, where I work, and the National Central Bureaus are the people who do the work. So the idea of the NCB is that it is a central point in the country for Interpol. It's generally the police force themselves who supply officers to it. The idea being, especially now in the IT age, is that they control the connection to the I-24/7 network, which I'll be talking about in a second, but basically they then push that out from their headquarters. They push it out to officers on the ground who need it, specialised teams who need the use of it on a regular basis. The 4 core functions are the police communications, obviously, and as when you're doing strategic management in college, they say, you know, concentrate on your knitting. And if we were to concentrate on our knitting is our communications, our global secure communication system. After that, you have databases, you have operational police support services where I work, and you have police training and development. The I-24/7 system, as it's called, is basically a VPN. It's protected, for those of you who are technically minded, it's protected by hardware as well as a software solution. And essentially speaking, over this VPN, you can drop email, you can run services like database queries, you can do all that sort of stuff over this VPN. It's fully secure, it's monitored on a 24/7 basis. So, you know, if anything were to be connected to the network that's not an official piece of kit, for want of a better word, then that will be stopped from gaining access to anything. It really is the hub of what we're talking about, and each of the NCBs is connected via this I-24/7 system to every other NCB. So us in Lyon may not necessarily see communications between those NCBs. So NCB Dublin and NCB London, for example, would be in constant contact with each other by email over this system. And they can have faith in the fact that it's secure because they were obviously present when it was set up, they designed it, they built it, they put it in themselves on their own infrastructure, etc. So every member country is connected, some better than others. I think the current the Interpol satellite connection in Somalia, for example, in Mogadishu, is currently the only internet connection in the country. So you can see that, and of course it's up and down on a regular basis. That's the I-24/7 system. Prior to that, believe it or not, and you can see that Canada was the first one to connect in 2003, believe it or not. And that just shows you when our current Secretary General took over, they were still using telex in the year 2002. And the big joke, of course, is that, well, at least we avoided the millennium bug. You know? Anyway, but now it's you can see here it's 12.5 million messages in 2009. So, you know, and those messages, I'm actually taking up duty in our Command and Control Centre next week, and so I'll be switched on to the Command and Control Centre email, and my BlackBerry is hopping today, and just on my way in the taxi I was scrolling down through some of the messages. I see an urgent message from Romania to Spain saying that, you know, this Spanish guy that you want, we've arrested him in Bucharest, please follow through with the paperwork urgently. There's a message on there about some stolen horses from Belgium that have been found in France. You know, so you know, again, we're away, we're as far as you can get from the Hollywood image. You know, a lot of it is, you know, we found a body. He's wearing, he has an ID card from your country. You know, that's not legible anymore. Can you give us some detail as to who you have missing that matches this? The mind and find situation. Mind and find, mobile and fixed Interpol network database. Basically, you can have an Interpol database down on the street level with you, if you like. That's the mobile, and obviously the find one is one which links into the national system. So when you do a check on the Garda Pulse system, for example, it will also check an Interpol database at the same time. We'll give you a result depending on what you're allowed to have back. So our database mind and find system. The operational data, this is core function number 2, operational data and databases. And these are a list of our databases. I'm going to go through them just very quickly. A nominal database, which is, as it says on the tin, our DNA database, which aims to have countries getting involved by uploading their DNA profiles to it. The fingerprints database, the Interpol, the International Child Sexual Exploitation database, which I'll be talking about later on, notices and diffusions, stolen, lost and travelled documents, stolen motor vehicles, and work of art. And you can start to see how an international database would play a role in this, especially in countries like in continental Europe. The DNA database, not too many countries involved in that yet, because a lot of countries have national issues in relation to DNA, obviously, and the whole Big Brother argument that's ongoing. But there was a man arrested in Holland for, I think it was shoplifting or something, what we would call petty crime, defined petty crime. But anyway, he was arrested in there, and they DNA everything and went into the database and solved 4 murders in Austria. And it turned out that this guy was a triad hitman who would travel around Europe for the triad gangs and carrying out beatings and murders on their behalf. Fingerprints database, obviously, same type of thing. Again, notices and diffusions. I'll be talking about notices in a moment, but basically we issue notices, publish Interpol notices. So some of you will have heard of the Interpol Red Notice, which is to find and arrest individuals, and I'll be talking about them in a second. Stolen, lost and travel documents, a relatively new database, but the thinking behind it is that these terrorists and people who are travelling, and international criminals who are travelling across borders, they're not travelling on their own passports, they're travelling on falsified passports or stolen passports or lost passports. And this has been a spectacular success. It's been put down to airports where, again, when your passport is scanned, it's checking this database as well. Not all countries are on board yet, but it's coming. And basically all it is a list of numbers. That's all it is, a long list of numbers of stolen or lost travel documents from the participating countries. So, of course, it has led to some to warnings coming out from the passport office. I see them now warning you that if you lose your passport, it's very important that you don't use it again if you find it again, because this database has resulted in some people spending some time in dark rooms in airports all around the world where they've used passports that they had reported lost. Stolen motor vehicles sounds like, you know, okay, your car is stolen outside your house tonight in Malahide, and it turns up later on in some other part of the city, whatever. This is more for stolen vehicles like serious plant, like big diggers and stuff like that cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of euros. Cars worth hundreds of thousands of euros that are stolen all over Europe, shipped to here in Ireland and England, for example. There's a huge traffic in high-powered, high-value cars to countries who drive on the left-hand side of the road in Africa. There's a huge traffic goes on there. It's worth millions and millions and millions of euros every year. That's what this database is about. And works of art obviously stands on its own. There's probably 100 million euros worth of art stolen from the Museum of Modern Art in Paris a couple of months ago. Actually, it's only about 3 weeks ago, and the head of the museum, of course, came out 2 days later to inform that the alarm hadn't been working since February, and he hadn't the money to put it right. Well, that was his excuse anyway. But the stolen works of art, again, if each police force would have somebody, generally speaking, responsible for works of art investigation, and there's a huge industry interest in it as well, because the insurance companies, for example, who have to pay out 100 million euros for a Picasso, want to be able to recover that as quickly as possible. So they would have a huge interest in this whole area. This is the notices and diffusions. The red notice, as I said, wanted persons. The blue notice seeking additional information. The green notice, which is very important in my particular field, in travelling sex offenders. We use the green notice where people are travelling, where people are likely to reoffend. And, you might say, yeah, it's a notice, so what, but this green notice might not be very important here in Ireland, where we would have the resources and we would have the people and we would have the interest and the operational capacity to do something about it. But over in Southeast Asia, for example, destination countries for child sexual abuse by Westerners, the green notice is extremely important to them. So when you have a convicted child sex offender who's travelling, then the issuance of a green notice can actually empower them in places like Cambodia and Philippines to refuse entry to these people based on the green notice. We're taking the decision to refuse you access. Missing persons, the yellow notice, and there's a special UN one, and the warning one then is threats and diffusions. I was talking to some techies last week, actually, ironically here in Dublin, and I explained to them how there's the latest thing now is a case that you can put on the back of your iPhone, which I don't have, but I'm sure some of you have iPhones, but it's basically a case that you put the iPhone in, and it's also has a built-in 2.2 pistol built into it. So that's the sort of thing that goes out on the warnings notices. A gun? Yeah, well, all you need to fire a bullet is pressure on the firing pin, so it's only a question of designing something around that. So you often find gun pens and gun. Yeah. It's one of the dangers of technology. Not being sure of my audience today, I did bring slides with a lot of figures on them, and you can, this is just the notices and diffusions, the nominal database, the DNA database. As you can see, there's only 55 countries participating, and there's a rather low number of hits, but as other countries become involved, like the UK or the USA, where they start uploading theirs, then you're going to see far more hits involved. The fingerprint database, 157 countries participating, and 1,006 hits where fingerprints are showing up for people who are travelling. These are people who are moving over and back between countries, and with the ease of travel nowadays, these type of databases make sense. Of course, they scare the pants off the Big Brother conspiracy theorists, and we accept that, but they are very valuable policing tools. Stolen, lost and travel documents, stolen motor vehicles, these are all figures. If anyone wants them, you can have them. If you need them for your thing, you can have them later on. Operational police support services. This breaks down into these crime areas, and so you can see I work in the Trafficking in Human Beings section, and you don't see any mention of child exploitation, but our Trafficking in Human Beings Sub-Directorate breaks down into three actually. You have on the trafficking side of the house, you have trafficking in human beings, but you also have smuggling in persons and trafficking in organs. While the other side of our trafficking in human beings house, is child exploitation, and you have the IIEA database, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes, and you have and everything else. So that's the way that breaks down. But you have DCO, drugs and organised crime, public safety and terrorism, financial and high-tech crime, fugitive investigative support, currently doing an operation called Infrared, where they're basically taking a red notice and working on it in an effort to find the person, and they're having some great success at the moment. And the anti-corruption crime area, which is a relatively recent one, but is having some major success in dealing with while linking in with the financial and high-tech crime area, dealing with a lot of money laundering issues from certain countries which would be involved in where politicians facing corruption is a way of life. We have a command and control and coordination centre which acts as a central point or a brain of the organisation. The CCC is manned 24/7. If there isn't somebody working there who speaks, there's always somebody working there who speaks one or most people speak two official languages, like I speak English and French. But you would find people from Spain who speak Spain and Arabic especially, or Moroccans who speak Spanish and that type of stuff. So most of the people there, you will have access to the 4 languages 24/7. So they might have to ring someone up to get Arabic translation done or something like that. But there is 24/7 coverage under the 4 official languages. They basically monitor media messages and they monitor open sources in an effort to add value to messages that they see. But as I said earlier on, there'd be huge traffic going on normally between NCB London and NCB Dublin, but they would never copy in the CCC. We don't have sight of those messages. They're messages that are sent between those 2 NCBs and none of our business. But if Dublin wanted to send a message to Pakistan, and say Pakistan is a country that the operator's previous knowledge of Pakistan is that it doesn't answer, they don't answer very often, or there's a time delay, the time lag or something like that, he will often copy in CCC, and CCC will stay on it. And they'll keep going, and they'll ring, and they'll fax, and they'll, I was going to say they'll telex, but I think we threw out the last telex machine last week. So, but they'll chase down the messages and they'll add value, they'll suggest which database might be of use or might be of benefit and requesting that sort of stuff. They also monitor the major event support teams or incident response teams that go on the ground. An example of an incident response team going on the ground would be, we have a major event support team, for example, in South Africa at the moment, who are helping access to checking border controls and all that sort of stuff. And again, it's been quite successful there, a huge amount of, again, that links in, of course, you've cross-function support there because people being trafficked into South Africa for the World Cup for prostitution purposes, all that sort of stuff. A big, an Interpol response team, for example, would have set up the disaster victim identification unit in Haiti, would have set up the DVI in Thailand after the tsunami. Still going actually in the office next door. There's still, someone was telling me there's an Irish doctor actually working over there still matching DNA, trying to identify victims from the tsunami. So what do we do to support our NCBs? Well, there's all sorts of stuff. Most of it is capacity building, training, making them aware of the tools that are available and how to maximise their use of those tools. As you can see, we have 7 regional bureaus in countries and areas that perhaps wouldn't have the operational capacity and knowledge that we would have or tend to have in the West. And these regional bureaus tend to be centres of excellence in those areas for international best practice and crime types and etc. 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 So you can see they're based in especially in Africa, they are huge, and oftentimes they're the only internet connection, for hundreds and maybe even thousands of miles. Moving on then quickly just into training sessions, that just gives you an idea of the priority, the main priority here because of Operation Oasis, which is money donated by Germany, huge amount of money over a period of time. So a lot of the training is concentrating in Africa using that money. But you can see we train all over in all of our regions. So I'm on to the section where I work in now, moving on to that area. And as I said already, you have trafficking in human beings, which breaks down into smuggling and trafficking of organs, and then you have crimes against children. And the crimes against children area is a priority in most countries. Most police services will list it as a priority, but it's often, paradoxically, maybe the most under-resourced section in the police force. There's no money involved in a lot of because it's needs-driven activity. I'm not talking about the internet here. I'm talking about just generally child sexual abuse. Generally, is a needs-driven activity, and so there's generally no money involved until you get into child trafficking or child prostitution. There's generally no money involved, and where there's no money involved, sad to say, sometimes it can slip down to priority. Where tiger kidnappings might be have a higher priority, or a spate of burglaries in an area might be more important. These are the policing realities. In our crimes against children section, our main vehicle for working, our main framework, is called the Interpol Crimes Against Children Specialist Working Group on Crimes Against Children. And it is, as it says on the tin, it's a working group of specialists who come together as needs be. They come together once a year, definitely, at a conference, which this year was cancelled because of a volcano with a strange name up in, and it was amazing.
A prize for anybody who could name it. Anybody? It's not the Vuvuzela, incidentally.
the old argument about I won't say the word in this company, but where decisions roll downhill. You know, everyone's having to make decisions that are going to be positive, but it kind of came down to me on Friday before midday for a conference starting on Monday with 300 or 400 people travelling all over the world to be there to call it off. And as you can imagine, the New Zealand, Australian and Hong Kong delegates who were sitting in a bar at Hong Kong airport were just delighted to be told that they'd spend another 2 days there drinking on my account. The working group basically breaks down into these subgroups: internet-facilitated crimes against children, sex offenders, serious and violent crimes against children, and victim identification. And I'll be talking about mostly here about internet-facilitated crimes against children and victim identification. So I'll just talk quickly about sex offenders. This work group, which is chaired by an officer from Seattle in Washington State in the USA, deals mainly with the issues surrounding the reintegration of sex offenders, management of sex offenders, reintegration into the community, the management of travelling sex offenders, and they're currently working on a General Assembly resolution. And that's how you get anything changed in Interpol. If you try and get a resolution passed at the General Assembly of Interpol to say A, B, C and D, and all of the police chiefs are there, they vote on it, they argue it, they discuss it, and if it's passed at the resolution, it becomes a resolution, it becomes a powerful document for any advocates of that particular course of action. So, for example, our sex offenders working group wants a resolution passed that will make it standard practice that a green notice would be issued for any missing sex offender. So anyone who's being managed, not all countries they're managed, but certainly where intelligence suggests that they've left the country, then a green notice should be issued. So that's a resolution that's currently out there. I have the serious and violent crimes against children have a resolution going forward to General Assembly this year relating to child abduction alert systems. Those of you who are familiar with them, you have Amber Alert in the USA, you have a new one started, Child Kidnap Alert in the UK, France has one, Belgium has one, Holland has one, and basically the first 4 hours after kidnap, where there's fear for the life of the child, the first 4 hours are statistically the child will be dead within 4 hours, essentially speaking, if the child has been kidnapped for a nefarious purpose of sexual or violence. And so this alert system basically goes off within an hour, alerts via the media, alerts the public to what you're looking for. This car has taken this child, they're dressed like this, and it goes out over the radio, it goes out over the television, it goes out over mobile phones if you've signed up for it, it goes onto the motorway information signs, and it works a treat, believe it or not. And there's been some fantastic successes. And an example would be recently in a French case, a man went into a shop and left his 4-year-old son standing out on the footpath, and a girl was sitting in the cafe next door looking at the child, thinking it's very irresponsible of the father, when another man walked up and took the child by the hand and walked away. And while she was still thinking about this, the father came out in a panic. Where's the child? Where's the child? So she went out and said, the man just took him, just gone down there. Panic, no sign of him. So they released him within the hour. It was 40 minutes or something. They released the alert. And the taxi man looked in his mirror, heard it on the radio, looked in his mirror, saw the man and boy and dropped them off at the apartment that they were going to, and notified the police, who were in the door a few minutes later and found a paedophile who had just been released from prison about 2 days previously. And the big funny thing about it was that the big controversy was not necessarily that he'd been released before his time or anything else. It was that he was prescribed Viagra in prison, and nobody had informed the management services when he was released that he had been on Viagra for 3 months prior to release. Then internet-facilitated crimes against children, which I've already spoken a little bit about, and victim identification, which I'm going to speak to you about now. This victim identification is by far the best and most valuable expenditure of resources for police services when dealing with child abuse material. You'll notice that I'm saying child abuse material and I'm not calling it child pornography. The reason being, and it's like if you look at the words ethnic cleansing, for example, that's from the point of view of the person carrying it out. The UN stated they prefer to use the word genocide rather than ethnic cleansing, because ethnic cleansing means that you're cleansing somebody. And so it's from the point of view of the offender. It's the same here. We don't like, within our network, to use the words child pornography because it's not pornography in the sense of adult pornography. It is actually, it can only be produced by the abuse of children. Pornography implies societal acceptance to a certain extent. Obviously, society in general accepts a certain level of pornography within it, even in car ads and bus stop signs, but also in your top shelf and tolerance of sex shops and that sort of stuff. And of course, finally, pornography implies consent. And as I've already told you, the vast majority of the material we're dealing with is under 10. And show me an under 10 who will consent to this type of abuse. So we call it child abuse material, and there's another child exploitation material. I won't get into the difference, but child abuse material basically is where there's a sex act being carried out on the child, or where the child is witnessing a sex act, or where there's concentration. The Irish law will be there's concentration on the anal or genital region of the child within the image or the movie. In the US, they use a very similar wording. They use the word lascivious on the anal and genital, lascivious concentration on the anal and genital region of the child. And the victim identification simply works by putting together a network of victim identification officers in the world who work more or less full-time. Now, the sad reality of it is there's probably only about 6 or 7 countries who have a full-time child victim identification unit. And what you do is you bring those people and other people who work it occasionally together in a virtual world, and the result is that they analyse all material that's seized as it's being processed. And the sad reality, of course, is that I say victim identification is the best way to spend resources in this area, because what are you doing? You're forgetting the fact that we're dealing with child abuse material or child exploitation material. By the way, I'll go back just quickly. Child exploitation material is where there's obviously sexual exploitation of the child, but doesn't breach the laws as set down in, for example, the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime or the Irish Child Trafficking and Pornography Act of 1998. It doesn't breach that law, but the child is obviously dressed in suspenders and makeup and bra, maybe 2 sizes too big, and you know it's a 9-year-old child wearing adult sexual clothing. Basically, there's obvious exploitation of the child. And the people who produce this material are cute. They produce it primarily for titillation, and they don't break the law. So it's one of the bigger challenges that law enforcement have, is that you can sometimes search a house, seize a computer, bring it back, analyse it, and you'll have 100,000 images on it, and not one of them breaches the act. And that can sometimes be quite annoying. So the real-time analysis of the material is very important. And the database that we have in Leon aims to gather all of the material that's out there on the internet and have it analysed in real time. And thankfully, we're quite successful in that. We're not getting all the material, of course we're not. But whatever material we're getting is being analysed in real time, and either an investigation starts or it's filed. There are 3 levels of filing. There's identified, unidentified, and as you can see, it's victim-centric. So there are identified victims, there are unidentified victims, and the last one is identified but not distributed. And that's where you only have the word of the offender who produced the material, that it hasn't been distributed. And oftentimes we find that it pops up in a search somewhere that he has shared it without telling, because people who offend in this way are natural minimizers. So they're never going to tell you that they've done something that they know you don't know, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Right. So the real-time analysis of the material, the child abuse material is worked as a crime scene. So it's examined minutely, both visually and forensically, in the background, the metadata of the image, the production of the image. It's examined minutely for any clue which will localise where the abuse is taking place. And the result of this real-time analysis is that we're concentrating more and more now on real material, on new material. And can anybody here hazard a guess as to why new material is more important? No. we have material going back that has been scanned on from little Lolita magazines that were produced legally in the 70s in Europe. So we have massive amounts of material in the unidentified going back years and years and years. The new material is most important because it's current abuse. Because it's current abuse. And that's the nature of the offenders on the internet. The nature of the offenders on the internet is that they commune, because that's what the internet does. And I read an article recently about the founder of Bebo, and he said, look, Bebo and Facebook, he said, they just serve a natural human desire to communicate and to commune, to come together and discuss whatever it is floats your boat. Right? And in this case, it just happens to be the abuse of children. Even though they don't call it that, because they call it pornography. And that's what floats their boat. And if you are in a community, and imagine that we are all connected virtually in a community of people who trade this material back and forward. And when I say trade, I mean like for like. There's no money involved in the vast majority of child abuse material. No money. And anyone who tells you that there is doing so for their own motives. But the vast majority of them, imagine we are all in this community here. Who is the most important person in this room? The most important person in this room is the man or woman, more and more, the man or woman who is producing new material. The person who can show that they are currently abusing a child. They are numero uno in the group. A society of deviants, they were called by one writer. And he's right. Because for us, the vast majority of us can't even contemplate abusing a child. Never mind that you would abuse for a gallery. But that's the reality. And so we often get series of images that will contain something that seems, where the child is holding a spoon during the abuse. Or they have, a word written in lipstick on their abdomen. Or they're holding a name on a piece of paper. We often get a series of images like that. And what is that? That is, basically from a criminological point of view, that is the offender who's abusing, proving to the gallery that he is actually abusing the child, because someone in the room will challenge him. And I say room, chat room. Someone in the chat room will challenge him to hold up my name on a piece of paper. And make sure it's crumpled so that you can't Photoshop it. Right? And so you're producing the new material. You are the king or queen. And so that's current abuse. So that for us is more important than archived abuse that's gone on in the past. The sad reality of policing, of course, is that it's not victim-centric. The Pelian policing systems that we are all familiar with, especially in Ireland and England and the US, is all about... Yes, somebody stole my bicycle. Okay. Statement of complaint, investigation, arrest, prosecution. That's the Pelian policing system. So, once the fella has made his complaint about his bicycle being stolen, the policeman doesn't care about him anymore. He has a complaint. So it's just the complainant. Lawyers among us will like that language. But it's the complainant who makes the complaint and the police investigate. So it's all about the offender from that point on. And unfortunately, in a lot of countries, it's all about the offender with child abuse material as well. Who's possessing it? Who's distributing it? Who's producing it? Now, obviously producing it is the most important in that trio. But the reality is that police resources tend to concentrate on who's possessing it. And so we spend inordinate amounts of time going out, arresting people, bringing them before the courts, charged with possessing this material. The resource famine, because it's a resource-hungry area, so the resource famine produced by this type of working ends up with the prosecutorial authorities. Speaking back now, I'm talking about globally here, this is a global problem. But the prosecutorial authorities will write back and say, you did how many searches? 120? And how many gigabytes of material have you seized there? Oh, 4,000 gigabytes, is that right? Okay, right. And what's it for? Oh, well, apparently they went on a website and they downloaded material. Okay, go in and give me 25 to 30 of the worst images off it and that'll do you. So our forensic examination concentrates only on the prosecution of the person in possession of it. Nobody imagines for a minute that this stuff didn't parachute onto the computer. That these are real children that we're dealing with here. That it's possible that this isn't a little Lolita magazine from the 1960s, that this is a child next door who's currently being abused. And we all know that children, from the Savvy report, from whatever, I extrapolated the figures recently on the Savvy report, and if you do the 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 argument, and you go on the census website, and you work it out, there's currently over 100,000 boys and 100,000 girls currently being abused in this country. Scary figure.
This country?
Yeah, if you extrapolate now, please don't get me wrong, I can't prove that. All I've done is I've taken the Savvy report 1 in 4, Savvy report 1 in 5, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys have reported sexual abuse before the age of 18. Now that's sexual abuse, we're not talking about any sort of mental or physical abuse. So if you extrapolate those figures out with the 2009 census, you're talking about over 100,000 currently being abused, of each sex. So 200,000 children being currently abused, of people under 18. And of course you can argue that that's just an extrapolation, it's not. Exactly. Right? But the point I'm trying to make is, because of the volume, and here we are this word again, because of the volume coming into forensic units all over the world, the path of least resistance is taken, and they forget about victim identification. So we're trying to change that mindset, and unfortunately, there's only 5 or 6 countries who are really active in it, who have really seen the value of it, but there's, 10, 12 countries who are supplying material to the database. Why would you want it in a database? Why would you want it in a database? The main reason is as an investigative tool. When you're looking for the victim, you need to gather it all together in one place, because there's no such thing as child sexual abuse, one picture. There's no such thing as one picture. I've never seen one picture of a child being abused. There's always a series. Because, of course, with our modern cameras now, you press the button and it's... Or with video cameras, like our friend over here has, it's just constant filming of it. And so you never see one picture. There's always a series. And what happens to us is we create the series inside the database. We create the series and then we put it out into a virtual area where we ask for anyone else see this child before. And then other countries will come in and say, yes, we've seen that child here, I've got these images, I've got these images. And each image, each possible image coming from all over the world, each one of them contains another piece of information on the series, another piece of information on the child, on the victim. And eventually, hopefully, you move it forward so that you can get in and get an investigation started in that country. If you can just localise it. If I just take a quick snapshot of this room, bang. There's not much would identify it. This here would identify it as being Irish. So it's up to the police in Ireland to investigate that. I don't get into my helicopter now and abseil out of it. I don't. No. So the whole idea would be that you can localise it to some place and start the investigation. The investigation launched then, of course, can be in any, but you have to identify this child. The child is currently being abused. It's in a kind of a victim-centric way. It's the only way that we can actually disclose on their behalf, because children don't disclose. We know that. Children don't disclose because they're groomed and blackmailed, because they're threatened, because they're in love. All right? So they don't disclose. We know that. The reality is, if I say to you that there's 200,000 children currently being abused in this country, is there 200,000 child sexual abuse investigations going on? The reality is no, of course not. So in this case, we can actually disclose on their behalf, and that can be very, very valuable. Where you go in and you stop current abuse. That's for any police officer, that's a very, very, very important work. And academics have identified it. Taylor and Quayle, who are actually both English, but did most of their work down in University College Cork. They identified that as being. They identified a lot in relation to how we could deal with this, but they identified that as valid, proper police work. The problem is that it goes against our appealing policing system. And so it's kind of contrary. Victim-centric policing is not something that we're used to in this country and in most Western countries. We're just not used to it. So this is an example of a national child abuse material flow. And while we are lucky in this country to have one national police force, and so competition is generally between units rather than where units come across. When you take the French policing system, where you have 4 or 5 different police services, you have the judicial police, you have the Police Nationale, you have the Gendarmerie, the customs would also have a role to play here, and then you have departmental, each department has its own judicial police, and each one of those is an independent republic answering to a préfet. you can see how complicated this gets. So what basically the system that we introduce is that you introduce a national child abuse material database. And they examine it first from a French point of view. So who's best to spot a French picture? Is a French officer. And we often get cases where an officer in a country will say, that's a French, French officer will say, that's a French picture. Why? I don't know why. I just know it's a French picture. I know it's a French child. I know by the way she's dressed. I know by the way she's holding herself in the movie. I know by the way the skirting board is run along there. It's a skirting board like the house I was brought up in. You know, that sort of feeling, that gut stuff that policemen boast about all the time. Most of them, unfortunately, don't possess. But the reality of it all is that it feeds, and in France they have a law that says within 28 days all material seized in France must be at this central point. And that is reality. That is ideal for us because it's victim-centric, it concentrates and it solves the problem. Because of course before you can buy the hose in a lot of public service areas, before you can buy the hose you have to point to the fire and say I needed to put this out, before they'll give you the money for the hose. And then you can go down to the hardware shop and buy the hose, and by that time you come back the building is burned down. But the reality here in France is that when this law was passed, it was passed over the heads of all the police officers who would say, no, we don't want it, and suddenly they had to put 10, 12, 14 men in here to deal with this. Men, I say men, I mean manpower. They had to put 14 people in to deal with this issue. And they have to deal with it. And they triage all the material coming in, and anything that's not French or anything that hasn't been seen before, because in the international environment we're not interested if it's seen before because it's analysed and filed. So we're not interested. So anything that hasn't been seen before is fed into the international database. And the international database then is where all of the countries who have an interest in this particular form of criminality will produce their material, will send their material. And what happens? What happens is you get the picture from the series that you've been waiting for. You have the series of material in the database for 6 months, and suddenly you get a picture with this in the background. Whoa! You know, and we named the series, obviously, so it's the Spoon series. Oh, right, Spoon series is Irish, send it there. Because we know the child, it mightn't be a totally new series of abuse, but there's one little clue in it that gives us a location. And then all of the series in relation to that victim are sent to Ireland for investigation. I have the Daphne written here because this is an example of how it works. The Australian police came across a video of a child being abused. She was speaking a foreign language. She definitely wasn't speaking Australian. So in the old days, and in countries where this wouldn't be an issue, that video would have just thrown in the bin. It's not Australian, we're not interested in it. And so in the old days it would have been thrown in the bin. In this case, they sent it to Interpol. It's a Northern European language. I was working and a Swiss officer was working, so I mean, it was all double Dutch to me. But to the Swedish officer, he said, that's Dutch. Definitely. So got the Dutch officer in to the virtual space, rang him, said, come into this and have a look at it and have a listen to this. So he listened. He heard, he said, that's Dutch all right, but it's Belgian Dutch, it's Flemish. Belgian officer in, oh, that's definitely Belgian Dutch, Flemish. And not only that, but it's from the city of Bruges. It's the way she says this word. And you can imagine if an Irish case, hey, hi, come here, you, it's not from Kerry, right? So within 6 or 7 hours of this coming onto the internet, there were police officers on the ground in Bruges looking for the child. And like every good Hollywood movie, the officer who came in on his day off to get his golf clubs that he'd forgotten in the office was walking out when another officer said, here, Jimmy, come over and have a look at this. And he goes, that's Daphne. Because she was a girl who was already vulnerable and was already in the detention of the police. So, case solved. And as is often the case in these, because Daphne was found, it was also discovered that her father, who was abusing her, was also abusing his sister, and this girl down the road, and this girl down the road, and he was selling their image and selling access to them to offenders from all over the world. That's the Interpol Child Abuse Image Database. What else do we do?
Just watching your time if you want to have a few little questions.
All right, I'll be wrapping up now in a minute.
That's fascinating.
I always leave the controversial stuff to the end. Isn't that right, Paul? That's an old trick you taught me. Leave the controversial stuff to the end. Other work that we do lots of other work, and especially surrounding the internet facilitated crimes against children. And we work with partners like In Hope, like the European Safer Internet, like the International Transmission or Telecommunications Union in the UN in Geneva, VGT, the Virtual Global Task Force, we're a member of that. That's kind of like a G8 of countries in this crime type. CERCAMP, which is an organisation of police which drives a police-driven blocking system where it blocks access to child abuse material on the internet. Operation support, obviously, where, for example, a Croatian officer recently discovered a website that had been housing this material, and he had a hold of the logs, and now he's got 65,000 IP addresses, dates and times from all over the world of people who've accessed this material. What does he do with it? Unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, he'll walk away from it because it just smells like too much work. So he'll walk away from it, but in some cases they come to us with it, or Europol indeed, but we'll give them operation support, box it up into different countries and send it out as an international operation. And then other countries will do it as they will. And of course training. I was recently in Bucharest there in January. I did two training courses there on combating child exploitation on the internet, where take regional cybercrime officers and train them up on the nuances surrounding, exactly like I've just talked to you here about victim identification and dealing with the multinational organisations. CERCAMP is a big one because it's blocking, and we have issues. There are big issues surrounding blocking. I won't get into them too much, but basically we would encourage countries and internet service providers to block access to illegal material. And for some people they'll say that's a no-brainer, and for other people say, oh, that's the thin end of the wedge, because once you start blocking the illegal material, you're going to start blocking the terrorist sites, and you're going to start blocking the bulimic websites, and you're going to start blocking suicide advocacy sites, and you're going to start... And of course it is, and it's a huge, again, societal impact. Us, we're not interested in the societal or philosophical arguments. We're interested in the legal material. We're police officers. And if the legislation is in place that makes this material illegal, then we would encourage internet service providers to block access to that. That's our bottom line, and we hide behind that law. And that's our high moral ground, if you like, if you will. We don't have to get into the debate about the Big Brother issues, the censorship issues. We don't have to. We can just stand back behind the law and say, well, it's illegal, block it. That's the argument. And anyone that's interested, I'll sit and talk to you all day about it.
Sorry, when you say we, do you mean Interpol?
I mean law enforcement generally. I'm speaking on behalf of law enforcement generally, international law enforcement. And our particular network of that framework that I work in, which is the Interpol Crimes Against Children, Specialist Working Group on Crimes Against Children, I suppose I'm talking about we there, because we're officers who are working on the ground, and these are the challenges we face. That's what we try to get up the ladder, is the challenges that we're facing, and one of them is access to this material, and here's why. Here's why. If we take this topology of online child content offenders, right? On the very bottom we have most of them. They're the simple users. They're the people who go in, they Google Lolita, they Google preteen hardcore, they get some form of a website or whatever, they get some sort of content, maybe a transient website up. I'm going to say it again, they masturbate to it, they shut it down, they mightn't go near it again for a week or 2 weeks. Then you have the open traders, people who operate, and as you go up this, you get more advanced technology and you get more security in place. You have the open traders. These are the people who are out there on peer-to-peer, trading material openly, all on a constant basis. The closed traders, now we're into community. You're out of the open pool, the shooting fish in a barrel, and you're into the closed traders.
Are they using credit cards at some point in that?
Generally speaking, they use them here.
Down the lower end?
Yeah. Right, and so these are the subject of our international operations.
The easier
now,
ones to count.
It's only anecdotal evidence, but 30% of those people here are actually hands-on abusing by the time the police get around to them. Now that's only anecdotal. I can't empirically prove that. Okay, in the US it's empirically proved to 70%. Personally, I don't believe that, but they showed it on sex offenders in a prison that were in prison for possession of child abuse material. 70% of them admitted to abusing children. I don't believe 70% is way too high, but I would say 30%. So that's 3 in 10, right, are actually abusing of these people here. The open traders, the closed traders are the groups and communities I talked about earlier on, and these are the experts up here. Never be caught. Never be caught. And if you draw the line here, you can say that up here is where you need the skill sets, you need undercover activity, you need a little certain degree of freedom in relation to whether you share or you don't share, that sort of stuff, from a law enforcement point of view. But certainly, these are the people, you need skill sets to work these people. The sad reality is that 78% of officers with the skill sets required are working here. So any preventative measure, be it engineering, be it education, or be it enforcement action that reduces this here for us, means that the likes of me who have skill sets required are able to work here and go after a higher level. Now, again, no proof that anybody on this triangle could be a producer. These are just people who possess and distribute. So anyone can be a producer, I admit that. And I can't say that this guy here, who's in a closed group, who uses proxy servers, who use remailers, who write their own software for breaking up files and publishing them, who never publish in the open. When they publish in the open, it's encrypted text. When they send something, it's encrypted. Their hard drives are, anyone who's technical here will understand that they use virtual machines to create encrypted drives within the virtual machine and inside another virtual machine, another encrypted drive, so you get through 3 levels of encryption before you even get access to the material. All that sort of stuff takes place here. There's not too many police officers in the world who have the skill sets required to deal with this, and anyone that is, they're all bogged down here. So anything you can do that reduces this has to be advantageous. Has to be. And that's it.
Well done.
All right. I could talk all day.